Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I have to be honest, this is another video that's not a historical knitting or sewing video, so if you're not particularly interested in anything different from that, please feel free to just skip this one. As you might know, I've been working on an 1892 outfit and I have created all of my undergarments so far. At this point, it's time for me to actually start sewing, and I chose a sewing pattern that was created by Angela Clayton, and I'm really excited to start sewing. However, I took out the pattern and I started to read the instructions and I got pretty overwhelmed. So I promptly sat down and I did some procrastinating, and I knit myself a heating pad cover, and it even has a pocket to warm my feet or preheat my pajamas before I go to bed. I said, okay, now that that's done, I'm actually going to sit down and work on some of this sewing. So I cut out all the pattern pieces that I would need to sew the skirt. And I saw the actual scale of the work that I had to do. I got a little bit intimidated, and so I promptly did some more crocheting. And I crocheted about half of a cardigan that I had always been wanting to do. I said, all right, fine, enough is enough. I'm going to actually sit down and work on this skirt. So I decided to cut out all the pieces of the muslin that I would need for the skirt to make up mock-up. And I started reading all the steps and instructions for all this different bits of sewing I would have to do, and I got a little bit overwhelmed and intimidated and everything above, and I said, you know what, I've done enough procrastinacrafting, why don't I do some procrasticooking? So I pulled out my delineator magazine from 1893 because I found a recipe for bread pudding. There's actually 3 separate recipes for apple bread pudding, and I decided to go with the one for which I had most of the ingredients already. I promise you I will get back to the historical sewing as soon as I can. Hopefully you guys enjoy this. I know I'm definitely no Mrs. Crocombe, but I'm still going to attempt to make the apple bread pudding the Victorian way.
Let's begin. For this recipe, you will need 3 sour apples, 4 slices of bread, 2 cups of milk, 1 cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon butter, 3 large eggs, 1 teaspoon vanilla extract or some nutmeg, and a sprinkling of cinnamon. Let's begin by preheating the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees Celsius. Next, I took my bread, which was a fresh brioche bread, and cut it up into bite-sized pieces. This is because the recipe calls for breadcrumbs, so I was going to be baking them in the oven to dry them out a little bit. I lined the baking sheet with aluminum foil and then spread out the bread pieces evenly in order to bake them in the oven. I baked them at 350 degrees for about 15 minutes or until they were mostly dry all the way through. After the bread pieces came out of the oven and cooled off a little bit, I cut them up into as small pieces as I could. The recipe did say to make them into full crumbs, but I decided to leave them a little bit chunkier because I like a few bread chunks in my finished bread pudding. Next, I boiled the 2 cups of milk in a small saucepan over medium heat. In order to make sure that the milk didn't burn, I stirred it constantly until it came to a boil. Once the milk came to a boil, I poured it over the previously chopped up breadcrumbs. And following the recipe, I added all of the sugar, the butter, the vanilla extract, and the sprinkles of cinnamon. That all got mixed together as gently as possible because I didn't want to break up the bread pieces that I had. After mixing it thoroughly, it got left to cool because we'll be adding the eggs next. The recipe calls for very well beaten eggs to be added to the previous mixture, and to make sure that the mixture is absolutely cold because you don't want to accidentally cook your eggs when you're adding them to a hot mixture. Now it's time to add the apples. I peeled and chopped up the apples into small bite-sized pieces. You can do this apple preparation while you're waiting for the previous mixture to cool down before adding your eggs. The recipe calls out that if you have sour apples, you can make nice big apple chunks to add to your bread pudding mixture. It does recommend that if you have sweeter apples, to chop up your apples more finely because it'll take longer for them to cook. The bread pudding recipe that I decided to use did say to steam this bread pudding mixture for 2 hours. I wasn't exactly sure what steaming meant, so I just put my bread pudding mixture in a normal baking pan, and then I added another baking pan full of water right below it so that while I was baking it in a traditional oven, at least hopefully there would be some steam created to fill the oven with a little bit extra moisture. The recipe doesn't call for an actual temperature at which to bake or steam this bread pudding at, so I just left the oven at 350 degrees and I baked it for about an hour, making sure to check on the bread pudding about halfway through. Depending on what size baking form you decide to use, you should probably check on your bread pudding more frequently. After 1 hour, my bread pudding was done. I will say that in the last 10 minutes, I did cover it with a little bit of aluminum foil because I saw that some of the apples that were sticking up were starting to turn pretty dark, so I wanted to protect them from burning during the last 10 minutes of the baking. But I do think that it looks absolutely delicious coming straight from the oven. I now took it out of the oven and let it cool for a little bit. Unfortunately, because I got quite distracted while baking this bread pudding, it was now about midnight while we were sitting down to take our first test of this bread pudding recipe. So we did take one nice bite of the pudding at night, but we saved most of the eating for the next morning. We sat down the next morning to have our slices of bread pudding for breakfast with some fruits and a nice cappuccino. This is such a delicious recipe, and I don't cook a lot of bread puddings, but I made this one again. Yes, it took me 3 hours to make the first time because, like I said, I got distracted, but the second time I made it, it took me about 30 minutes of prep and 1 hour of cooking, so an hour and a half total to make a bread pudding. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I promise that I'll get back to some more of the historical knitting and sewing topics very soon. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. If you enjoy this video, go ahead and give it a like and let me know also if you like me doing things like this. But other than that, I'll see you again really soon.